With the confirmation that Zach Cregger will be directing a new Resident Evil movie coming out in 2026, it's been making me think a lot about what I want to see in a new reboot. If you don't know who Zach Cregger is, apart from originally being in the comedy group Whitest Kids You Know, he's the guy who directed Barbarian. That movie in particular actually has a lot of elements of what I would want to see in a new Resident Evil movie. Although, before we get into what I want to see in the new one, we should probably take a look at why the Resident Evil films have been so divisive and often outright bad in the past. While a couple of those old Resident Evil movies were directed by other people, that franchise was more or less helmed by Paul W.S. Anderson. Apart from making a couple decent films, this guy isn't exactly known for making hits. Beyond not being faithful to the source material, he just could not for the life of him understand what makes the Resident Evil games interesting and fun. While those original few Resident Evil games were inspired by B-movies of the time, they were only really that way in style, while still retaining a fairly high level of quality. The problem with Paul's films, Resident Evil or not, is that they are possibly even below B quality while lacking any real style of their own. Multiple decades later, this is somehow still an aspect that you'll see in his movies today. His Resident Evil films generally lacked any recognizable characters, and even when they did, they were either sidelined or killed off screen. On top of that, I could go on and on about things like tonal issues or how they absolutely mangled any sort of attempt at bringing plot lines from the games into the movies. They're just bad. It's this lack of understanding of the source material that essentially severed any sort of connection that they could have had with the fans. While silly at times, the games generally have a great horror atmosphere, fun gameplay, and engaging stories. But when you remove those aspects, you get scenes like this.
This is borderline experimental.
This makes no sense at all.
While those were bad enough, it doesn't end there. Fast forwarding nearly 2 decades from the original film, we get a new reboot from director Johannes Roberts. A self-proclaimed fan of the games himself, at the time, it seemed like fans were finally getting what they've always wanted. A faithful adaptation that revels in the horror aspects and gives these beloved characters proper screen time. Unfortunately, Welcome to Raccoon City is an example of what happens when you stick a little too closely to the source material, as contradictory as that sounds. At times, this movie almost feels like a fan film in the sense that it just recreates scenes from the games while lacking anything substantial to warrant its own existence. In my opinion, when it comes to adaptations, it's best to faithfully use elements from the original in the pursuit of creating something new out of it, so that it serves as more of a companion piece rather than just a copy. While this is slightly off topic, that's personally my problem with The Last of Us show. While very well made, it sticks so true to the original game that it never felt like what I was watching served any kind of purpose. In the case of Welcome to Raccoon City, it just comes across as a pale imitation of something much, much greater. It also didn't help that in a very odd choice, they decided to merge the first 2 games together. It would have been so much better if they just did one game before the other so that they could properly flesh out each of the game's stories, and maybe even expand on things that the original games didn't get to. The problem with the fusion of both of these narratives is that neither of them have enough time to showcase what they have to offer, so the movie often feels rushed and incomplete. My idea of a near-perfect adaptation is that of Cyberpunk Edgerunners. It retained so many recognizable elements from the game while crafting an incredible new story. The keyword being new. It proved that you can have a different take on a world and characters while keeping the essence of the original alive, and even introducing new concepts. Besides the writing and story structure, fans also didn't really jive with the casting. Personally, I thought the cast was fine, and probably could have given better performances if they had a better script to work with. Although, I definitely agree that the characterizations are off, at least in terms of the writing. It does make it hard to believe that you're supposedly watching the characters from the games. If you've made it this far, please consider subscribing. I'm trying to grow this channel, and it is incredibly helpful to do so. Moving on from Welcome to Raccoon City, in regards to the Netflix show, believe it or not, there isn't really that much to say. It essentially has all of the same problems in relation to everything I've mentioned before. It's just another lame attempt at adapting this series, although it somehow managed to make itself even less recognizable than anything before it.
Beautiful 180, crazy.
I so genuinely don't understand how they managed to fuck it up even harder. With all that said, fast forwarding to 2025, we're finally ready to talk about the future. Beyond being a very gifted storyteller, Zach clearly understands the horror genre, both psychologically and atmospherically. Barbarian has so many elements that would be perfect for a Resident Evil adaptation. It manages to be both scary and funny, has likable characters that lets you get even more invested in the story, and it's not afraid to get pretty crazy at times. While I definitely want a spooky atmosphere for most of the movie, I also don't want it to be afraid to get batshit crazy, or else we would already be straying away from the spirit of Resident Evil. Resident Evil is not Silent Hill. Any underlying messaging is usually left a tad bit under the surface, because at the end of the day, this franchise is about fun and creativity. Resident Evil of all franchises isn't exactly known for having the deepest of themes. It just takes a lot of cleverness to make the audience care about it. After watching Barbarian, I can see that Zach clearly understands the concept of creating a serious plot and world while leaving room for fun and exciting moments. Another great example of this combination would be the Evil Dead films, a franchise that I wouldn't be surprised if both the games and Zach Cregger himself have pulled inspiration from. All in all, I'm not too concerned with the feel and atmosphere, as he's pretty much already done it with Barbarian, just on a much smaller scale. When it comes to the characters, I honestly don't mind them using people from the games, although it might confuse some people who aren't necessarily that familiar with the games but saw the last movie. While I'm not too opinionated when it comes to which characters they end up using, I just want them to feel like they actually belong in what has clearly always been a bit of a heightened world. Even though I really do love RE7 and RE8, I just don't want a repeat of Ethan, where we get a character that feels like they just walked in from a completely different world. And even worse, is incredibly boring, at least in my opinion, and many others. Characters aside, personally, I would really like if we went with a new story this time around. That way, we don't have to restrict the creativity of the filmmaker by having to stick too closely to a game's pre-existing story. It would allow this movie to be more of a companion piece, like I said earlier. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I want a movie that's able to view these games through fresh eyes, instead of just making an abridged version of the games. And worse, not doing them justice. While those 3D animated movies are pretty hit or miss, I think they have the right idea and showcase what I mean pretty well. Honestly, assuming that the movie is good, I personally wouldn't even mind if it's canon. While making the movie canon is going to risk fan backlash if it's not up to par, I think it would be cool to be able to add to the continuity through a different medium as long as the additions feel organic. That's basically what James Gunn is doing with the new DCU. Regardless if it's a television show, movie, tie-in comic book, video game, anything has the possibility of adding to the continuity as long as it's actually worth adding. Also, just as a side note, while I don't think all of the Resident Evil comics are necessarily worth reading, they have some cool concepts that I would love to see adapted in some fashion. There's plenty of lore, canon or not, that could help flesh out the world of this movie. Eventually, I actually want to make a whole video just about those comics, because while they do vary in quality, I actually think there's some gems in there, and a lot of the time they're pretty creative. Depending on when this movie takes place, in terms of how far along the various viruses have progressed, I kind of think it would be cool to continue the theme of adding different elements from various mythologies into the world, kind of like how RE8 did with adding vampires and werewolves. I only say that because I don't want the main threat of this movie to feel redundant. After all these years, there's only so many ways you can make mutated variations of zombies interesting. Before we end the video, I just want to talk about who the main villain can be. While I truly love almost all of the villains we've gotten before, in my opinion, the best course of action would be to create an entirely new threat, although I would still like if they were somewhat tied to past events or characters, kind of like Mother Miranda from RE8, having had a connection to Spencer. While the canonicity of this movie isn't going to be known until it's out, I still wouldn't mind organic callbacks or references like these so that it still feels like there's a solidified world. At the end of the day, I'm not asking for the best movie ever, but I do want a proper love letter to both the series and fans that uses all of the right elements from the games to make a fun experience not just for gamers, but also people who are unfamiliar with the series. One of the many goals of this film is that this movie should be so fun that even new audiences are so enthralled with the world that they decide to check out the games. Without setting my expectations too high, I do have confidence that this new adaptation will be a solid movie, or at the bare minimum, it should be better than what came before. With that said, thank you for watching. If you got this far, make sure to comment below with what you want to see in the new movie. The Resident Evil community is awesome, and I'm glad to be a part of it, so I'm curious to see what your thoughts are. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Have a good one.